But let's forget the radical environmentalism.
If you are polluted, you are also a violator.
Freedom and a safe environment goes hand in hand.
Our next speaker comes from the UK. She graduated at London School of Economics and Political Science. She is a communications officer and lead Redstone scholar at the Institute of Economic Affairs. She is a regular guest on British media, having been featured in outlets like BBC, LBC, GB News, Talk TV and The Telegraph. Her speech is called Free the Market, Save the Planet. It's Reem Ibrahim. So thank you, Reem, for being here. The stage is yours.
Hello everyone, how are you all doing today? Good? Amazing, wonderful, excellent. I know I'm one of the last talks, so you might all be falling asleep a little bit, but I hope that the British enthusiasm will encourage all of you to stay awake and listen to all of the hopefully interesting things I have to say. So my name is Reem Ibrahim and I come from the Institute of Economic Affairs based in London. And what I do, my job is effectively to communicate all of our excellent academic ideas. So instead of this research paper being sat on a shelf where nobody is reading or listening to it, actually people being able to understand those ideas across the media and indeed in public debates like this. So thank you very, very much for Students for Liberty Portugal for putting on this excellent conference where we can all exchange these ideas and listen to one another. So my talk today is going to be about freeing the market in order to save the planet. Now you've heard a little bit today about the best approaches towards free market environmentalism, but if we just come back to the core here and look at where this approach has already worked, I think that it helps us convince other people about why free markets and individual liberty are the best approaches and the best solutions to so many of the world's problems. So, first of all, show of hands. Who here likes free trade? I like free trade. Who can tell me why? Why do you like free trade? Someone tell me. Who likes free trade? Tell me. Anybody? Anybody going to respond? Yes.
Doesn't have the influence of the government.
Excellent. Without the influence of the government, we don't like the government. Libertarians often are exactly like that. I also don't like the government. Anybody else? You can tell me from a maybe economic perspective. Yes. Excellent. Okay, this is exactly the kind of point I wanted to make here. We're talking about comparative advantage, which is an idea that was sort of discussed by so many different economists throughout history. I am British, so I have to, of course, highlight Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations and in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. But talking about this idea that actually freer trade allows you to get products that in other countries they produce, and in your country they might not produce it, or if they do try to produce it, they're not very good at it. And other countries have a comparative advantage, meaning that they are much more able to produce those products more efficiently. So who put their hands up for they like free trade? Did everybody put their hand up, I'm assuming? Amazing. Congratulations, you are all environmentalists. Why, you might say? Why? What do you mean you're an environmentalist? I will tell you why. We're talking about efficiencies, and we're talking about the best way to improve economic efficiencies and indeed energy efficiencies to reduce carbon emissions, to actually save the planet in a meaningful way. And the best way to do that is through the price mechanism, and it is through comparative advantage, all of these wonderful, wonderful economic concepts that are only possible through free trade. You're going to say, Reem, you're a liar. Okay, let me give you some examples. So, deregulation in order to decarbonise. So the deregulation of natural gas occurred in the 1980s. This is mainly focused in the US, but it did end up occurring across Europe as well. And electrical power markets in the 1990s. Now that helped set the stage for the fracking revolution and trigger the decarbonisation of US power and energy markets. In 1989, the Natural Gas Wellhead Decontrol Act deregulated the natural gas market itself. And this allowed producers equal access to interstate gas pipelines. At the same time, it opened up those markets to new competition. So new ways of using those competitive mechanisms in the market in order to improve economic efficiencies and indeed improve energy use. These reforms led to the fracking revolution, replacing coal with natural gas, which reduces up to 60% less CO2. So here is an example of where we've seen deregulation. We've seen the government's regulation rolled back as a result of the reforms in the 1980s. And as a direct result of that, we have seen something, a new policy change, a new consequence, an unintended consequence that is actually quite positive. And we've seen that happen, and the result has been lower CO2 emissions. But there's more. Natural gas deregulation, detailed with similar measures in electricity markets, has multiplied those benefits. So across the world, what we've then seen is energy being used more efficiently as a direct result of the government taking a step back and allowing the market to actually work in itself. And the result has been more efficient energy use. So effectively, it seeks to increase the supply of products and services in the economy instead of reducing demand or increasing demand. So the focus is on supply rather than demand, and it prioritizes economic growth and focuses on relative prices. Now, by reducing income and capital gains tax, for example, entrepreneurs are much more incentivized to produce. And this is exactly what's happened following those supply-side tax cuts in the 1980s. We saw it happen in the US, we also saw it happen where I'm from in the UK. And those higher incentives increased efficiencies both in the US and in the UK, and the capitalization of the US stock markets. Now, these market conditions, these freer market conditions, they were much freer in the 1980s than they were in the 1970s. Those market conditions made it possible for new, ambitious tech companies such as Microsoft, Apple, Cisco, and Oracle, amongst countless others, to then go public. Who here has a phone? Do you all have phones? Yes, it is 2024. You must all have a phone. Think about how many different products that once existed, well, they still exist. Then think of things like calculators, notebooks, calculators and calendars and all of these different things that you might have had to carry around one day. Now you have that all in your mobile phone. You all have all of those wonderful things in your mobile phone. That is increased efficiency. In the most simple terms, in the most simple layman's terms, that is what an increased efficiency actually looks like. Now, this obviously led to the technological revolution. And with the development of smartphones and the World Wide Web, we're using the internet, which replaced tons of expensive and wasteful infrastructure and reduced our demand for things like paper. So, thinking about this, the bottom paragraph there, how many trees have actually been saved because we now have access to emails? How many people in the 1980s were actually thinking about saving those trees? Now, the environmentalist kind of pro-environment, save the planet movement wasn't as mainstream as it is today in the 1980s. And let's be honest, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were not thinking about saving the planet when they were implementing these economic reforms. And yet, the unintended positive consequences of freer markets has been increased efficiencies and, as a result, a headway into saving the planet and reducing those carbon emissions in itself. Those specific supply-side tax cuts led to those unforeseeable innovations and unanticipated benefits. Energy efficiency. You can't talk about the planet and the environment without talking about energy specifically. Now, accelerated depreciation happened in the US, I think it was 1981, and happened in a couple of other countries as a result of that as well. It allows property owners to deduct a larger proportion of their property's value as the expense in the early years of ownership. So it makes sense when you think about it in economic terms. Everyone knows that an older car, if you buy a new car and you get on the road, the value of that car decreases significantly. We all know that happens. I actually can't drive. I live in London and none of us drive, but that's me admitting that. But I know from hearing other people's experiences, their truths, that their cars tend to reduce in value significantly as soon as they take it out on the road. So That means that if a new car's value cuts in half the instant you drive it on the road. And so accelerated depreciation takes that into account, as well as the fact that property owners are likely to spend more money on things like repairs during their first few years of ownership. In the energy sector, so thinking about how this logic applies in the energy sector, accelerated depreciation meant lower costs for land, plants, and equipment, which then incentivized greater investment in land, plants, and equipment, which then resulted in more economic growth, employment, overall prosperity, all of the great things that we love as free marketeers. But those were the intended benefits of accelerated depreciation. As a result of accelerated depreciation and deregulating that market as well, it also produced unintended benefits, positive unintended benefits. So broadly, the reduced cost of investment in land, plants, and equipment encouraged uptake of the latest and most advanced technologies, but more specifically, it helped the US decouple energy use per unit of GDP. So it meant that actually we're decoupling energy use in itself. So again, this is an example of a policy change that's happened as a result of the desire for further economic growth, the desire for freer trade, and the desire for better economic circumstances. And unintentionally, but rather positively as a result, we have seen increased efficiencies in the market. Free trade. Now, throughout the 1980s and even into the 90s, the support for freer trade, and by freer trade, I mean what we mentioned earlier about the lovely gentleman with the very, very lovely suit that he can't get in Greece, but can get elsewhere, as a result of it being imported into the beautiful country that is Greece. You see actually comparative advantage, and you see those particular countries being able to specialise in producing a particular product. The UK doesn't really produce much except for services, so that we don't really export much of those physical goods. Now, the North American Free Trade Agreement kicked off an era of international trade agreements. So we all know from all of the countries that we're from that they're involved in some kind of free trade agreement. So NAFTA and all of these other trade agreements contributed to the development of new cross-border supply chains, and that meant that costs were lowered and productivity increased. And one result you're probably familiar with is the Japanese and German car makers. They were able to remain global leaders in the introduction of long-lasting cars. So cars that last a lot longer, you're able to use them for a lot more time, and that obviously results in increased efficiencies. So the Toyota car company became famous for and synonymous with durability. Hondas and Subarus weren't far behind. And so free trade has actually ensured that competition from those Japanese automakers had the desired effect on European and American automobiles, specifically with manufacturing. But it also prompted car makers in those places to prioritize durability. So they prioritize the longevity of these products. These cars are being used for a lot longer than they actually otherwise would have been as a result of those incentives that worked in the market. Now, at the time, very few people realised that buying one durable car and using it for 15 years would be much more fuel efficient than buying a new vehicle every 5 years. But nowadays, we can look back and conclude that freer trade has actually accelerated low carbon innovation and reduced average vehicle fleet emissions throughout the world. So, free the market, save the planet, and progress the world. I mean this very, very strongly. The fact that at the moment we have people that don't understand these historical events and can't see that the best way to improve efficiencies, the best way to reduce carbon emissions, and ultimately the best way to save the planet and save the world is through technological advancements. It's through improvement and efficiencies in the market. It is through innovation that in so many respects is only possible through freer trade and through the market and through the innovation process. we have to make sure that we are making those arguments so specifically. Now, unfortunately, the majority of people in my generation, I am 22, the majority of people in my generation don't understand this, right? The majority of people in my generation believe that socialism is the ideal economic system, at least in the UK and in the US. Of course, we've seen in Argentina huge upwaves of young people that now believe so strongly in free markets and individual liberty. Unfortunately, we've not been as great at that in European countries and indeed in the US as well. And so making these very, very specific arguments is so important. Now, the bang for your buck when it comes to talking about environmental policy is so much more significant, specifically because young people do feel driven by this environmental problem. And so if you win them over on these arguments, you win them over on freer markets being the best way to save the planet, then you win them over on everything else. You win them over on the economy as a whole. You win them over on the ills of central planning. You win them over on the absolute imperative of freer trade and freer markets and businesses being allowed to voluntarily trade with one another. I think it's really, really important that we make a specific point. Now, when it comes to the current situation in many, many different countries, we've seen governments looking at top-down ways in order to reduce carbon emissions. So, for example, in the UK, where I'm from, we've got something called net zero. We have to achieve net zero by a certain date. So net neutrality by a certain date. Now, what that means is, as a result of that arbitrary target, businesses and other world leaders have to then decide to get into that, and they have to then decide to implement a whole load of other regulations. So there are those negative unintended consequences. Now, it's really, really important that we have those particular conversations because the current situation is the solution to climate change is more government intervention. That's what the majority of people believe. And that's why it's more important than ever to make the arguments for freer trade and individual liberty. I want to just finish on this final note. Israel Kirzner, one of my favorite economists personally, made the point that the entrepreneur, the particular person that makes those innovations happen, has to act within a freer society in order for them to actually be able to innovate and have the space and the freedom to do so. But what the entrepreneur does is discover resources that have up until that point been undervalued. So in those particular arguments and in those particular instances, entrepreneurs have that ability and they have that need. That can only happen in a free market. It can't happen in a central planned economy. We've seen that historically time and time again. All of you are here because you believe in free trade. And I'm telling you now that because you believe in free trade, you are also an environmentalist. And you are also one step closer to actually achieving climate change and actually receiving those particular policies. So we have to make the arguments for free trade if we want to save the planet. Thank you.
Yeah, does anyone have questions or any commentary?
You were talking about Argentina and also in South America in general, that people are becoming like libertarian. So in Europe, you just have to wait for the socialist governments to screw up a lot, like they did in South America, and the majority of people will become libertarian.
That's a very, very good point. Argentina was effectively able to cultivate this very, very wonderful and very, very strong movement for freedom and for free economies after experiencing some of the worst economic deprivation that the world has ever really seen. So let's hope we don't have to get that bad in order for us to believe in free markets. But yes, very good point. Any other thoughts or feelings?
I want to know, actually, at the beginning, I don't know what free trade means. Is that means like tax-free trading? What does it mean?
Yeah. Okay. Good point. So I would define free trade as the ability for businesses to trade freely across borders. And by freedom, I mean without the unnecessary intervention of government. So that does include tax. So I use the examples of deregulation and the government taking a step back when it comes to regulatory reform. But also that looks like particular examples of taxes. So, for example, governments taking a huge portion of tax. What I would say is this looks very, very different in Europe than it does in continents like Africa. So in Africa, I'm North African, I'm half Egyptian, half Moroccan. In Africa, in so many of those countries, free trade or the restrictions on trade are not quotas and tariffs and taxes and regulations in the sense that we think of it as, but they're actually non-tariff trade barriers. So, for example, if you're a female entrepreneur and you're in Ghana and you want to bring over some goods into a bordering African country, and you want to then give over those goods in that particular place because you've got a factory there, and you're a young woman, you're an entrepreneur, and you're very, very excited to be there, you risk sexual assault at the border, you risk corruption at the border, you probably have to give the border guards some money to bribe them to let you even bring those goods over. So I would say restrictions on trade look very, very different in some countries than in others. In the European context, that is, of course, tariffs, quotas, trade barriers and the way that we think of them. But in other countries and other nations, actually the restrictions on trade can look very, very different. And it's often the result of non-tariff trade barriers, things like corruption and indeed crime, and also the lack of property rights. If you own a property and a country doesn't have very good property rights, like many African countries don't, then you own this property, you own this factory, and somebody else can just take it from you, and there is no consequences, legal consequences. That also acts as a barrier to trade and a restriction on investment, because if you're a foreign investor, you're not going to risk your capital. You're going to be less likely to risk your capital in a country that doesn't have property rights and free trade. So yes, the restrictions on trade look very, very different in different countries.
Yeah, actually, I have an example to give because from where I came from, there are like factory that produce the products, and the people who are working at the factory, they will get the product that was going to export and then resell them. Just cut the brand and then they just resell them. Does that count as free trade?
As in taking a brand and then reselling it?
Yes, they just make the goods without tagging it, just sell the rest.
Well, I mean, it depends on what your perspective on free trade is. I would say business has every right to package their products in any way they wish to.
But they're not the business owner. Like, they're just workers from the factory. They have their...
Oh, right. Okay. So,
Yeah.
that's a restriction on property rights. Those particular products are owned by the company. And if a worker is effectively stealing them from the business, then that is that's criminal activity, and that's not allowed. Less so to do with free trade, more so to do with property rights. On that point.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I know we've probably run out of time, but I just like hearing from everybody else and hearing what all of you have to say. But thank you so much. If you're interested in learning a bit more about the economic benefits of free trade, I actually did 2 videos with Learn Liberty, which are a Students for Liberty kind of offshoot project. And they're on the YouTube channel, and they sort of explain these ideas in a lot more detail as well. And yes, so thank you very much, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of your day.
Shrimp.